My name's Neil Faulkner and I'm the joint author of Creeping Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. And I'm going to try and answer the question, what do we mean by fascism? And I think the first thing to say is that it arises as a mass phenomenon, a mass political phenomenon, only really in the context of crisis. When capitalism, world capitalism, capitalism in each country, as an economic, social and political system is in crisis, fascism can emerge from the margins of political life and become a mass force. And that's to do with the fact that when crisis hits us and when large numbers of people find themselves insecure, uncertain about the future, their living standards perhaps falling, perhaps experiencing unemployment and so on, in those conditions of insecurity and deterioration in social conditions, people are not prepared, understandably, to accept the continuity of the old order unchanged. They demand change, they demand radical solutions. And solutions in a context of capitalist crisis emerge from the right and from the left. It is the centre, representing the mainstream, the status quo, that cannot hold in a crisis. What does the far right, what does fascism offer in the context of crisis? It essentially means two things. It is a mass mobilisation of the reactionary right around ideas of nationalism, racism, sexism, authoritarianism, and nowadays also climate change denial and climate nihilism, with a kind of vision of a new world which involves a return to imagined traditional conservative values in the past, but that's very often laced with an embracing of new technology. But fundamental to it is that it's essentially a set of reactionary ideas. It's a mass movement of the right, not a mass movement of the left. And that's one element in the definition of fascism. The second is this: it drives towards, it aims at the destruction of democracy, the destruction of the labour movement, the destruction of independent social movements, the destruction of free expression, a liberal press, an open press, and so on. In other words, it drives towards a more authoritarian, top-down, dictatorial form of government, of regime, and crucially, it is an attack on independent working class organisation. That is, the ability of working people to organise themselves to fight back in their own interest. In other words, if you like, fascism is the system defending itself by crushing opposition, by crushing dissent that is coming from the left and is driving towards a progressive alternative, a progressive future, a progressive solution to the crisis. The class composition of a fascist movement, what kinds of people become fascists? Very often, fascism draws heavily on the middle strata of society, that is, people who have a sense that their position, which is a little bit better perhaps than people at the bottom of the system, that position which they have established for themselves is under threat, it's become insecure, they're worried about the crisis causing them to drop in the social scale, to lose their jobs, to lose their careers, to lose their savings, whatever. That class of insecure, middle-ranking people, but also at lower levels in the social structure, where working people, ordinary working people, are atomized, where they lack class organisation, where they lack an ability to fight back effectively in collective organisation, in trade unions and so on. Very often those atomized, unorganised people at the bottom of society are open to the simplistic messages of the far right, which is about scapegoating, it's about blaming minorities, it's about an assertion of racism and xenophobia as a kind of explanation of the crisis, an explanation of why people's lives are falling apart. But the drive of the fascist movement, the inner dynamic of the fascist movement, is towards the destruction of any capacity for ordinary people to fight back effectively in their own interests. And that's why in periods of deep crisis, sections of the ruling class, sections of the very top levels of society, what we would nowadays perhaps call the 1%, they will give their backing to the fascists. So at moments of extreme crisis, you see that it is top people in society and the state itself very often, which is lifting the fascists to power. Well, invariably, the state is involved in lifting the fascists to power where they are successful. Now, those are broad generalizations. Let me just repeat so it's clear. It arises as a mass phenomenon in the context of capitalist crisis. It is a mass mobilization of the reactionary right. It is a movement which is driving towards the establishment of some kind of authoritarian regime, and it tends to be backed by atomized people and people who are feeling increasingly insecure but don't have effective organizations of their own as a way of fighting back and protecting their interests. What has sometimes been called human dust. It's a grouping together, a banding together of human dust in the context of crisis. Let me give some historical examples, and I'm not particularly going to talk right now about how we apply the concept of fascism to movements that we can see around us in the early part of the 21st century. I want to use the historical examples that we've got to substantiate that analysis of capitalism, analysis of fascism, and to make this point about it. It takes many diverse forms. I'm just going to mention 4 different types of fascism that we can see playing out in the interwar period in the 1920s and the 1930s. The classic example, of course, is the German Nazis. And in the case of the German Nazis, we see the creation of paramilitary forces to an extreme, to the point where in 1932, on the eve of taking power, Hitler had something like 400,000 brown shirts organized into a paramilitary force. Even so, even in that most extreme case where there was a huge level of street violence and the fascists were organized as a paramilitary force, that was not decisive in Hitler coming to power. Although Hitler, in the 2 elections which took place in 1932, he emerged at the head of the largest party, he never won an absolute majority, and his paramilitary forces could never have taken power in opposition to the German state, the German army. What was crucial in January 1933 to the Nazi victory was that the German state, headed by President Hindenburg, backed with whole sections of the German capitalist class, were happy to see Hitler made head of government because they saw the Nazis as a way of smashing the left, of driving back the possibility of social revolution. So even in the extreme case of the Nazi movement, the role of the ruling class, the role of the existing state is crucial. That's even clearer if we look at the example of Italy. Italy goes fascist in 1922 when Mussolini becomes the fascist dictator, but not really a dictator immediately. If you look at the way in which Italian fascism develops, again, it's the king, it's the existing state, it's the existing ruling class that invites Mussolini to form a government in 1922. Mussolini's paramilitaries, the black shirts, are relatively few. We're talking about a few tens of thousands at the most. And in fact, the organised working class, the organised left, was much stronger than the black shirts, but the state, the army, the police, in alliance with the black shirts, with the fascists, means that it's possible to create a Mussolini government. But for several years after that, Parliament continues to function, opposition political parties continue to function. There is an increasingly fragile, but nonetheless still to some degree existent, liberal parliamentary democracy. It's not until 1926, 1927 that a full fascist type dictatorship is established in Italy. In other words, it was a process of increasing fascist domination of the state to the point where it becomes a dictatorship which has effectively destroyed democracy and independent working class organisation. You have a different kind of trajectory if you look at what happens in Spain. In Spain, there is a military coup in 1936. That military coup aims at overthrowing a fairly moderate reformist government. It was an alliance of liberals and social democrats, but there's a military coup to overthrow it. The response to that is a working class revolution in large parts of Spain, and the workers rise up and they seek arms and they create militias and they build a movement to defend the Spanish Republic against the military in the context of the Civil War, which rages in Spain between 1936 and 1939. The fascist party, the Falangist party, forms part of a coalition, a military alliance of conservative forces, but throughout the Spanish Civil War, the leadership is not fascist. The leadership is provided by generals. The most important of them, of course, becomes the dictator after the defeat of the revolutionary movement, the defeat of the Republic. That's Francisco Franco. The role of the Falange is to provide soldiers and also to provide death squads. And the Falangists, as allies of the conservative forces in the Civil War, carry out most of the mass murders, tens of thousands of people killed, the mass murders of socialists and trade unionists and others fighting on the side of the Republic. Let me give one final example of interwar fascism, just to underline the diversity of fascist movements last time round, and how we have to have this in mind when we try and evaluate what is and isn't fascist when we look around us in the world today. And that example is Japanese fascism, where there are fascist parties, there are fascist groups, organised fascist groups in Japanese society, to some degree in the 20s, particularly in the 1930s. But the main drive towards a fascist type regime comes from within the Imperial Japanese Army, where far-right ideas become dominant inside the officer corps, particularly among young officers. They become a model, they create a model, a militaristic, fascistic sort of model, which is followed by many other young men, Japanese right-wing youth. And in the course of the 1930s, liberal parliamentary democracy, because Japan had been not a terribly successful democracy, but a democracy of sorts, liberal parliamentary democracy in the course of the 1930s breaks down. And by the time of the attack on China, an imperialist attack on China in 1937, and certainly by the time of the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941, Japan is effectively fascist in that there is a militarist regime, a regime dominated by army officers. Democracy has effectively ceased to operate, and that dictatorship takes the form of a mass movement among officers and soldiers, and more generally in society, which is promoting an ideology of nationalism and racism and militarism and authoritarianism and so on. Fascism, in other words, can take many different forms. It can play out in different ways, in different historical contexts, and we have to be flexible in the way in which we apply our theoretical understanding of what fascism is in the context of the capitalist crisis which is now unfolding at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. And we also need to be absolutely clear of the terrible danger that it represents, the danger of authoritarianism, a destruction of democracy, an ideology of nationalism and racism and xenophobia, which within it has the potential to become, has the germs of genocidal behavior and ethnic cleansing, all of that, and the danger as well of rearming, of militarism, of new wars, and in the context, of course, of our own period, unlike the situation in the 20s and the 30s, the additional problem that the far right, the fascist form of politics which is emerging with the growth of far-right movements today, these people are climate change deniers, or they are climate nihilists, people who do not care about what is happening to the planet and are prepared to drive us. If they don't drive us into war, if they don't drive us into genocide, the danger is that they will drive us into planetary breakdown. We need to understand what fascism is. We need to look at the historical experience of fascism in the 20s and the 30s, and we need to apply that understanding to what is going on in the world today and develop effective strategies for fighting the menace that we now face, and to ensure that they do not, again, as they did in the 1940s, take us down into the abyss of barbarism. So we are trying to develop new theory, new understanding to make sense of what is going on in the world right now, which of course, you know, history repeats itself, but it never repeats itself exactly. So you need to look at what is going on, and you need to try and apply the lessons of the past, but you need to update the understanding one gains from the past in relation to what's going on in the present. So what I want to do is to put some ideas which are new, and by new I mean ideas we've been developing over the last 2 or 3 weeks, literally, as we try and make sense of the nature of the Johnson-Cummings regime and the contradictions which seem to be emerging at a fairly early stage in the development of that project. But I'm going to put it in the frame created by creeping fascism. And I think it's probably quite useful right at the very beginning to answer this question, so that there's absolutely no doubt in anybody's mind what we mean when we use the term fascism. It means essentially 2 things in the context of a world capitalist crisis. Without the context of world capitalist crisis and people's lives falling apart, causing people to drift away from the centre, to distrust the centre, and to look for more radical solutions that match the scale of the social crisis. That's the context for mass fascism. It's not the context for any kind of fascism. There are mad fascist groups on the fringes all the time, but they can only potentially become a mass force in the context of capitalist crisis. It's a response to capitalist crisis, but it's then 2 things. It's a mass movement of the reactionary right. It's a mass movement organised around the ideas of nationalism, racism, authoritarianism, sexism, militarism, and so on. It's turning that nest of traditional right-wing ideas, traditional conservative ideas, into an active political force. It is that. And secondly, it is a mass movement mobilised in that way, which is driving towards the destruction of democracy, either completely or to a large degree. And crucially, what that means for us is the destruction of independent working class organisation and the possibility of independent working class organisation. In other words, it's a right-wing response to the crisis, the purpose of which, in a sense, is to destroy the possibility of the working class putting forward its own solution in the context of a crisis. That's what it is. And everything else, in a sense, is secondary, and it therefore takes different forms in different situations. It takes different forms in different places in the 1920s and the 1930s. It takes different forms in different places now. So we've got to actually look at the concrete examples and the diversity of different forms, but the basics are crisis, a mass movement of the right around reactionary ideas, and a threat to democracy and the ability of the working class to operate. Now, that means a number of things. It means that paramilitaries may or may not have a significant role in any particular fascist movement. Sometimes they play a very important part, and sometimes they play a secondary part, and sometimes they play virtually no part at all in a fascist movement. And that's because to build a paramilitary, you've got to have an enemy. A paramilitary is an organisation for taking somebody on the streets. And there are forms of fascism where paramilitaries play a secondary or even a negligible role in the movement. That's the first thing to say. It's not fundamental to the different definition of what fascism is. The second thing to say is that in all cases, including the most extreme examples of fascism, the most extreme, I suppose, is Nazi Germany, in all cases, without exception, the state, the existing bourgeois state, taken over by the fascist movement, is the primary instrument of repression. The SA, the brown shirts, did not murder 6 million Jews. That was done by the German state, which had been taken over by the Nazi Party. It was sections of that state machine that organised the Holocaust. Very, very important that we are clear that the objective, in a sense, of any serious fascist movement is to take over the bourgeois state and to turn that state into an instrument for the implementation of a fascist programme. And the third crucial thing I want to say by way of sort of qualification, really, is that fascism is a process. It's a process of political development which takes place in relation to other forces that are in play, which is why you may or may not get a development of paramilitaries, depending on the degree to which the left is organised and attempts to defend itself against fascism. You may or may not get an evolution of a regime to the point where it is carrying out mass genocide and ethnic cleansing. When Hitler came to power in 1933, his programme did not say, his manifesto did not say we're going to gas 6 million Jews. The Holocaust doesn't really get underway until 1941 in the context of the Second World War and the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Ukraine. And then, when they've got huge numbers of people that they want to get rid of, they start, they're not simply ethnically cleansing, they're then also beginning to exterminate people and do it in a systematic way. That's a process. There is a process of development going on, even in the case of the most extreme forms of fascism. So paramilitaries are secondary. The state is always the primary instrument of repression, and fascism has to be seen as something that is developing in a concrete historical situation. Now, let's bring it up to the present, and I do want to say something about India. I want to say this about India, because you look at the most extreme example in order to understand the general trend, because the extreme example shows you starkly what are the forces that are in play, that are unfolding. You look at what is happening in India. There's absolutely no question that what is happening in India is correctly described as fascism. The Prime Minister of India is still a member of the RSS. The RSS is a mass fascist organisation with millions of members, with whole contingents of that organisation organised in a paramilitary way. They do military exercises together. There are mass Nuremberg type sort of rallies. They are organised to go onto the streets, armed, and the pogroms which have just, I mean, the BBC and all of the kind of liberal media talk about communal rioting. There has been no communal rioting that I can see in India over the last month or two. What's actually been happening in India is that Hindu fascist mobs with a green light from the Modi regime, and that green light is given really by this citizenship, this highly discriminatory racist citizenship bill. They've been given the green light to attack Muslim communities. So Hindu fascist mobs have gone into Muslim areas. They have destroyed Muslim homes, destroyed Muslim businesses, destroyed mosques. In some cases, they've burnt people alive inside their homes. You can see the footage there are lots. There's video online where you can see Muslims being isolated and then beaten up, clubbed by these Hindu fascist mobs. And of course, Muslim communities have tried to defend themselves against these attacks, and that's how you can get it being spun in the liberal media as some kind of communal rioting. This, alongside the fact that the regime is building a network of camps. They are concentration camps. They're building a dozen, 15, 20 concentration camps across the country. Apparently in the state of Assam, close to the border, they're building concentration camps with a capacity of about 2 million. As they strip Muslims of their citizenship, their Indian citizenship, or deem them never to have been Indian citizens, which is what they're actually doing, they get classified as illegals, and then they can be rounded up and put into concentration camps. Now, if this is not state-driven fascism with paramilitary auxiliaries acting with the authority of the regime, the sanction of the regime, I don't know, what is. Why is India important? Because it's warning us very, very clearly of a direction of travel, because Modi's regime is comparable with a wide range of other regimes that are operating in the world today. This is part of a wave of nationalism and racism and fascism. And the reason why we developed this term I think we probably first came up with the term 3 or 4 years ago, actually, when Trump was first elected, and in the context of the Brexit referendum, we came up with this term, creeping fascism, because we wanted to make clear that fascism is a process and that it takes different forms in different places, and we need to have a sense that there is a direction of travel, that we're moving in a particular direction. We can see it absolutely clearly now in the case of India. Now, the next thing I want to say, and it's a little bit disjointed because we're wanting to make a number of different points, really, because we want people to talk this through, because this is not fully worked out. This is, we're actively trying to theorize what's going on. I just want to throw this point in about the crash. It looks like there's been a momentary stabilization. Today the markets have gone up a little bit. But it hasn't just gone through the floor as it might have done. That it will at some point go through the floor seems highly likely, because there is a vast mountain of debt which has accumulated since the 2008 crash. I looked at the figures the other day, and I think when the estimate, when it crashed last time in 2008, the estimate was that they had $175 trillion of debt globally. And the estimates now are they've got about $250 trillion of debt globally. So the size of if anything, the debt bubble is even bigger than it was last time round. Lots of economists, Marxist economists, Keynesian economists are saying this is set to collapse. For a moment, it looked as if coronavirus would be the trigger, a little bit like subprime mortgages in the States last time round. And actually, they seem to have lost control of coronavirus. So it could well be still the case that coronavirus is what's going to tip us into a new financial crash. Now, if that happens, the crisis which began in 2008, which has given us 12 years of austerity for the working class and a further siphoning of wealth to the top for the rich, that will be intensified massively. And that will, of course, change the whole context for everything. And the far right has its response to any intensification of the crisis. They have a way of dealing with it. Now that's just I'm just injecting that into the discussion so that we're sort of aware of the way in which things could move. This is what I want to say about the Johnson-Cummings regime. It seems to me and us, I mean, because Phil Hurst has also been writing with me on this on the site, that the Johnson-Cummings regime does represent a government of a different sort. This is not just a right-wing conservative government. It's not comparable with the Thatcher government, for example, which was a mainstream conservative government. This is not that. There is a push against the norms of liberal parliamentary democracy. There is a push towards a more authoritarian form of government comparable with what is, what's happening in the United States. It's represented by all sorts of things that we can see going on. Most recently, obviously, the way in which, an unprecedented event, the head of the Home Office emerges to denounce Priti Patel, who is one of the nastiest members of the regime. There's nothing like that in post-war British history, or perhaps ever in British history. It's an indication of the degree to which there's a culture of bullying and a push towards what, and I'm going to use this term that we used in the article because John Bellamy Foster in the States has used it in relation to the Trump regime. He's used the term Gleichschaltung, which is a term that was used in Germany in the 1930s, and it means streamlining, coordination, bringing all of the different bits of government into line with the program of the would-be authoritarian regime. There is a process of Gleichschaltung being attempted in the States under Trump, and I think there are already indications that we are moving in that direction in relation to the Johnson regime. Cummings, who is the kind of Steve Bannon of the regime, Cummings clearly has a vision of politics which is informed by a kind of far-right authoritarian understanding of how you get things done. So there's the authoritarianism, there is the visceral sort of racism, which is represented by, most obviously by the immigration bill, the proposed immigration bill with its point system, which is blatantly directed at unskilled migrant workers who are black and brown, and they're refugees from war and poverty, and so transparently racist. And of course the deportation flights, and that of course is the regime openly sort of throwing migrants, throwing the oppressed to the the racist mob that voted for them. But we also think, you see, what we'd have said, what Phil and I, and maybe all of us really, would have said 6 months ago, a year ago, is that there is no basis in modern capitalism for the kind of economic nationalist program that was implemented by the fascist regimes in the 1930s. And I think we no longer think that. I think we no longer think it because while it is true that globalization is a fundamental trend in world capitalism, that you've got a world economy which is more dominated by mega corporations operating on a transnational basis than ever before, that's all true. However, if you look at the reality on the ground, these mega conglomerates are subcontracting to lots of other companies, smaller companies usually, companies with a local national base usually. So although the ownership of, let's take the example of HS2, they go ahead with HS2, the ownership might be Chinese, whatever that means. In fact, lots and lots of local companies and lots of other companies also operating on a transnational basis are going to get a bite of the cherry and are going to be part of the actual project and therefore part of the profit flow. It's too simplistic to say it's all globalized and therefore there's no conceivable kind of economic nationalist program that might be implemented. That's the first thing to say about this. Second thing to say about this is that the state, of course, which probably has a greater degree of autonomy than was the case in the 60s, say, when you had a much more clearly defined, firmly anchored block of national capital that was in a sense represented by the state. With the development of transnational mega corporations, the state potentially becomes a more independent actor. And what is it doing? It's levying tribute, taxes. It's siphoning those taxes, of course, to the state. And then it's contracting with private corporations to build, say, HS2 or whatever it is. And those corporations, they're transnational corporations, but also they're local corporations. Those corporations are then the recipients of the revenue streams, the recipients of the profits. The whole privatization drive, of course, is all about opening up new opportunities for the big private corporations to make profit. Now, it seems to us as well that you've got a situation where the state can actually use its ability to bring in resources through taxation and borrowing, and then use those resources to contract with private companies to do particular bits of national infrastructure. Now, if this is true, you have the possibility, it seems to us, of a national capitalist accumulation project which is driven by a far-right regime, where you've got, in a sense, the regime coming into conflict with traditional sections of capital that are not really particularly interested in this, and the regime is actually, it's pandering to the interests of certain companies, but it's also pandering to its potential electoral base. So there are corporations and there are groups of workers who potentially benefit from a particular infrastructure project. And so does the kind of Hitler model, the 1930s type model, fit at all? Where, what do the Nazis do? The Nazis, they borrow and they tax, and then they contract with private corporations to build the autobahns. And by 1939, everybody's got a job in Germany. I mean, the wages have gone down. All of the trade unionists are in concentration camps. There's no democracy, but everybody's got a job. And actually, Hitler's quite popular in 1939. What we're suggesting here is that we should not simply assume that the Johnson-Cummings regime cannot implement some kind of economic national project, and we want to have that discussion about, because we need to understand the nature of the regime. Is that the last thing I want to say? Yes, except for what this adds up to is not just that they threaten us with racism, with xenophobia, with the oppression of minorities, with militarism, with arms expenditure, with an increasing danger of war, and also now, unlike in the 20s and the 30s, we've got the additional problem that they are climate change deniers or climate change nihilists, potentially taking us into the abyss of ecological breakdown. Not only have we got all of that, but we've got the real possibility, it seems to me, that they might actually they might operate in such a way as to try and consolidate and expand that electoral base that they have built for themselves in much the same way as the fascist regimes of the 20s and the 30s did.